enough doctors, there aren't enough nurses, there aren't enough teachers. There are more cars on the road than there were when you came to power. The train service doesn't work. Violent crime is rising. Is that what you meant by the new Britain?
No, we accept there are all sorts of things we still got to do, but to take each one of those things in turn, there are more doctors than when we came to power. There are about 17,000 more nurses than when we came to power. Crime is actually down 10%, burglary down 25%. So I would say to you, in 4 years, we don't say we've done everything. We've made a start, we've laid foundations, now we've got far more to do.
But you said in your last manifesto, over the 5 years of a Labour government, we will rebuild the NHS. You didn't say anything about it taking 3 terms.
No, but what we did say was that we made a specific pledge on waiting lists, and we said we would start to put right the rebuilding of a national health service where it depended on need and not ability to pay. And as a result of that, we've actually got some 17,000 more nurses, I say, more doctors. There's a hospital building programme underway and so on.
But you did, with respect, you didn't say that. Over the 5 years of a Labour government, we will rebuild the NHS. Did you underestimate the task or what?
I don't think we underestimated the task.
Well, why did you say you'd do it in 5 years?
Well, we didn't actually say we'd do everything in 5 years.
Well, we will rebuild the NHS in 5 years.
I'm sorry.
Explicit.
We made it clear that we couldn't do everything in the first term.
Well, why did you say it then?
Well, because if you actually look at the full text of what we said, we've made it quite clear we couldn't say that.
It's in the manifesto here.
It is in the manifesto, and we made a specific pledge, which was to get the waiting list down by 100,000. Now, actually, we've achieved that pledge, but it is plain that we have to... It's never going to be done overnight. Of course it will take time. However, we are now getting...
Was it a mistake to say it then?
No, it wasn't a mistake to say it. We do have to rebuild the National Health Service, and we are doing it.
But you said we will rebuild the NHS in 5 years.
What we said was that we will rebuild the National Health Service, and that is precisely what we're doing.
Over the 5 years of a Labour government, it says so in so many words.
Jeremy, we made it absolutely clear to people. I mean, the pledge that we gave on health was a pledge that we would reduce waiting lists by 100,000. Now, by no stretch of the imagination could you say that that is every problem the health service dealt with. But in addition, we never actually pledged, incidentally, in the last manifesto, a single extra nurse. But we've provided 17,000 more.
But you did pledge.
And we provided no... We didn't commit ourselves, in fact, to providing any extra doctors and consultants, but we have provided many more.
But you did pledge to rebuild the NHS in 5 years, and that hasn't happened. You accept that hasn't happened. You made a start on it, perhaps.
We certainly have made a start on it, and that is important to do. And incidentally, just before you leave that, I made it absolutely clear throughout that we could not accomplish it all in one term.
Are you still committed to reaching the European average on health spending by 2003-2004?
No, I didn't say that we were committed to reach the European average by 2003-04.
You did say that.
What I said was that by the end of the second comprehensive spending review, I wanted to reach the European average.
Right, so when is that?
Well, the first comprehensive spending review comes to an end 2003-04, and then you've got the next 3-year period after that.
So we're talking about 2006-2007?
Yes, but I made it clear again, because this refers to an interview I gave, I think, on the Frost programme.
Yes.
I made it clear again that we could only do that provided the economy remained strong.
And that would be the intention, to reach the European average at that date, not the European average at the time that you made the promise.
Exactly.
So it's a promise firmly, assuming all things being equal.
Well, it's assuming the strength of the economy. And I can't sit here and write the comprehensive spending review now. But what it is
so it's just an aspiration, is it? Or?
Well, it's what exactly I said at the time. If you've actually got the words, you probably do, of what I said at the time, you will see that I said that provided the economy remains strong, then we should be able to reach the European average. And incidentally, if we do that, we will only be able to achieve the changes we want in the health service if we accompany it by far-reaching reform. Money is important in the health service, but it's not all it needs.
But it's a firm commitment that if it by 2006, 2007, if the European average is 8%, 9%, it will be that in this country unless we've had some sort of economic collapse.
No, I didn't say unless there was an economic collapse. I said provided the economy carried on being strong. I wasn't saying there was going to be some economic collapse.
Well, strong is a relative judgment, of course, isn't it?
Well, it is a relative judgment, but look, it stands to reason that obviously you can't sit down and work out your spending plans now, but it is our objective to reach the European average, and it is indeed our objective to carry on not merely raising health service spending, but raising education spending as well, which is why the choice in the election is so stark, because the Conservatives are saying £20 billion worth of cuts, and we're saying keep the investment going.
I assume that you believe the economy will remain strong.
I certainly do believe that, yes.
Can we look then at your longer term plans? There are proposals in here, and everybody understands that this is a longer term project you're embarked upon, but plans here that stretch 10 years. Mm-hmm. So not just this government, but the next government.
Well, it's sensible, I think, in public service to set out a longer term perspective, which is why we've set out a health service plan and education, transport and so on.
But your budget plans, of course, only extend to 2003, 2004. Mm-hmm. Do you accept that at that point you will either have to cut spending plans or you will have to raise taxes?
No, I don't accept that, because the reason why we've been able to get so much money going into the health service and schools now, the reason why we've got forward investment plans for schools, hospitals, crime, transport, is because we've had a strong economy and because of two other things which are absolutely vital. The first is a reduction of the national debt, which has reduced interest payments on debt, because we were paying out more on interest payments and debt than on the school system when we came to office. We're now spending £10 billion more on the school system. And secondly, because unemployment is down, there are fewer benefit claimants, many people have moved off benefit and into work through programs like the New Deal, and so we've saved several £billion like that as well. Now,
so it can be squared, this circle?
Well, you can spend more money provided you have a strong economy, and B, you're making sure that you're not spending on the costs of economic and social failure. And you referred to my manifesto at the last election. One of, I think it was virtually the opening point of the 10-point contract, was spending less on the bills of social and economic failure and more on investment in education.
You talk in this latest manifesto for this election about using the private sector to support public endeavour in the public services. What exactly do you think the private sector could do that can't be done by the public sector?
I think you've got a very good example at the moment with the PFI programmes on both school and hospital building. I mean, they've been immensely successful. We've built the hospitals on cost and on time. That is one example. Another example is for example, in winter pressures, this year particularly, we've been prepared to use the private sector where the public sector doesn't have enough facilities to do so.
But you've been talking about a radical second term. Mm-hmm. You're now talking about more of the same.
No, I'm not talking about more of the same. I'm talking obviously about building on what we've done, but that's not the only thing about the health service plan that's important. The plan is also important, for example, in breaking down the demarcations between nurses and doctors and consultants. I see no reason why nurses can't, for example, prescribe more medicines, do some of the jobs that doctors or consultants have traditionally done. There are doctors already in this country today providing some of the minor surgery. There are consultants reorganising the entire way that they work.
But when you talk about the spirit of entrepreneurship entering into the public services, doesn't that rather indicate that you made a mistake in reversing many of the Conservatives' divisions between providers and purchasers, for example, or GP fund holders?
In the health service, you mean?
Yes.
No, I don't think so, because the trouble with the fund holder system was that you had a two-tier system, and what was happening was...
How's it going to manifest itself then?
Well, I mean, that's a classic example, actually, of a change that's not to do with the private sector, but the primary care trusts, which bring together groups of local GPs and others, they are able far more effectively to organise their system and get decent health care for people. And actually by, I think, 2004, they will handle something like 75% of the entire NHS budget. Now that's a hugely radical change, but it's not in fact dependent on the relationship with the private sector. Having said that, I see absolutely no reason why you shouldn't break down barriers between the public and the private sector, and indeed the voluntary sector.
What's
as well.
the model here? Rail track?
No, the model is not rail track, Jeremy. We oppose rail privatisation, and we're not following that in any of the work that the private sector we're doing. Well, I've just given you an example. The Private Finance Initiative for Schools and Hospitals is an example of the private sector and public sector working together.
A lot of people who work in the public sector have asked me, will you ask the Prime Minister why he's so in love with the private sector?
I'm in love with the private sector. I simply believe in getting the job done by the most appropriate means.
But they remember your remarks about scars on your back. Well,
that was about pushing through change in the public sector and how difficult it is. But I think if you talk to a big private sector manager who'd push through change there, they'd find it difficult there. Really what I was talking about was the nature of change, and it is difficult. Look, let me give you an example. When we started off with the literacy and numeracy strategy for primary schools, we had a lot of opposition from teachers and others. In fact, the teachers had done brilliantly. We've put through that strategy. We've got the best ever primary school results this country's seen. So, you know, change can be difficult. There are people, some of the complaints of doctors, for example, relate to NHS Direct or the walk-in centres, where people can come in off the street and get immediate access to decent health care.
Let me ask you a question then about
and I'm on the level of the private sector, incidentally. I just believe that where you can use the private sector, use it.
Do you think that a company can make too much in profits?
In what sense do you mean?
Do you think profits can ever be unjustifiably large?
I think they can be if they're monopoly profits, which is why we, for example, taxed the privatised utilities, got the excess profits and put that to work in the New Deal. But I don't believe, for example, that if you're acting in a competitive market, it's the job of government to come along and tell a company you're making too much profit.
Do you believe that an individual can earn too much money?
I don't really. It's not a view that I have. What you mean, that we should sort of cap someone's income? Not really. No. Why? What's the point? You could spend ages trying to stop the sort of highest paid earners earning the money, and actually in an international market today, you probably just drive them abroad. What does that matter? Surely the important thing is to level up those people that don't have opportunity in our society.
But where is the justice in taxing someone who earns £34,000 a year, which is about enough to cover a mortgage on a one-bedroom flat in outer London, at the same rate as you tax somebody who earns 34 million?
Because the person who earns the person who earns 34 million, if they're paying the top rate of tax on the 34 million, will pay far more tax than the person on 34,000.
Yes, I'm asking about the rate of tax.
Yeah, I know, and what I'm saying to you is actually the rate is less important in this instance than the overall amount of tax that people would pay. But you know what would happen if you go back to the days of high top rates of tax. You know what would happen. All that would happen is that those people who are small in number, actually, and you can spend an awful lot of time trying to get after the person earning millions of pounds a year, and then what you don't do is apply the real energy where it's necessary on things, for example, like the children's tax credit, the working families tax credit, the minimum wage, the New Deal, all these things that have helped people on lower incomes.
But where's the justice in it?
Well, the justice, you see, when you say to me, where is the justice in that? The justice for me is concentrated on lifting the incomes of those that don't have a decent income. I don't see, it's not a burning ambition for me to make sure that sort of David Beckham earns less money.
But Prime Minister, the gap between rich and poor has widened while you've been in office.
Well, actually, a lot of those figures, incidentally, are based on a couple of years ago, before many of the measures we took came into effect. But the lowest income families in this country are benefiting from the government. Sure. Their incomes are rising up. Now, the fact that you have some people at the top end earning
benefit more.
Well, if they're earning more, fine, they pay their taxes. But
is it acceptable for the gap between rich and poor to widen?
It is acceptable for those people on lower incomes to have their incomes raised. It is unacceptable that they're not given the chances. To me, the key thing is not whether the gap between the person who earns the most in the country and the person that earns the least, whether that gap is different or not.
So it is acceptable for the gap to widen between rich and poor?
It's not acceptable for poor people not to be given the chances they need in life.
That's not my question.
I know it's not your question, but it's the way I choose to answer it. Because if you end up going after those people who are the most wealthy in society, then what you actually end up doing is in fact not even helping those at the bottom end. Now,
so the answer to the straight question, is it acceptable for the gap between rich and poor to get wider? The answer you're saying is yes.
No, it's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that my task is to
You're not saying no.
But I don't think that is the issue. I think the issue is...
You may not think it's the issue, but it is the question with the greatest of respect.
It may be the question.
Is it okay for the gap to get wider?
It may be the question, but it's not the way I choose to answer it. The way I choose to answer it is to say the job of government is to make sure that those at the bottom end get the chances they don't have.
Prime Minister, with respect, people see you ask an absolutely straightforward question and they see you not answering it.
Yeah, because I choose to answer it in the way that I'm answering it.
But you're not answering it.
I am answering it. What I'm saying is that the most important thing is to level up, not level down.
Is it acceptable for the gap between rich and poor to get bigger?
But what I'm saying to you is that the issue isn't, in fact, whether the very richest person ends up becoming richer. The issue is actually whether the poorest person is given the chance that they don't otherwise have.
I understand what you're saying, but the question is about the gap.
Yes, I know what your question is, and I'm choosing to answer it in my way rather than yours.
You're not answering it.
I am. I'm answering it in the way that I believe it's the role of government.
You're answering another question.
Well, I'm answering, actually, in the way that I want to answer it. And I'll tell you why I want to answer it in this way. Because if you end up saying, no, actually, my task is to stop the person earning a lot of money, you waste all your time and energy taking some money off the people who are very wealthy, when in actual fact, in today's world, they probably simply move elsewhere and make their money. And what you're not asking me about, but which would be a far more fruitful line of endeavour, is what are you doing for the poorest people in our society to give them a boost?
OK, well, let's talk a little bit about tax. You have promised.
Well, why don't we talk about the poorest in society and what we're actually doing for them?
Prime Minister, I assume you want to be Prime Minister. I just want to be an interviewer. Okay, so can we stick to that arrangement?
Sure.
Fine. You've promised that you won't raise the basic level of income tax and you won't raise the higher rate of income tax. You have conceded that national insurance is a tax. National insurance is a tax based upon income. Why won't you?
Lots of things. Says capital gains tax.
Why won't you give a guarantee about national insurance?
Because I'm not entering into a situation where we start writing a budget.
Well, why are you prepared to make a guarantee about income tax?
Because the specific manifesto pledges we made last time on income tax we have repeated.
But you also gave an assurance on national insurance, not in the manifesto, but Gordon Brown gave it, that the ceiling wouldn't be raised.
Yeah, but if we end up going through each of the reliefs, I mean the tax.
Why could you do it last
pledges,
time but not this time?
Well, we are in fact. What we're doing is making precisely the same tax pledges in our manifesto as we did last time.
No, you're not. With the greatest of respect, last time you promised that the ceiling on national insurance would not be raised.
In fact, what Gordon Brown was asked was about the abolition of the national insurance ceiling in the context of the 1992 shadow budget. Now, I've made it clear to people, I've been asked this question ad nauseum during the campaign, and what I've answered to people is, look, we have not clobbered higher tax earners, we've got no intention of doing so, but if you start going through national insurance, then you're onto inheritance tax, then you're onto...
I'm not asking about any of those things, just national insurance.
But that's where you'd end up. And what I can't do is sit here and write a budget, I'm afraid.
But I'm merely asking you why you could give this guarantee last time, you can't give it this time, and whether any reasonable person wouldn't suppose that you therefore propose to increase national insurance contributions.
Well, they shouldn't. But we're simply not sitting, because we're not sitting down and writing a budget now. And we've got a record of 4 years to stand on when we haven't done any of these things. Indeed, when we've been very careful to make sure that the highest income earners are not put at risk or their incentives reduced. And I've got no intention of going back on that now.
But isn't it intellectually incoherent to say what you'll do with one tax and not to do with another tax which is levied on almost the same basis?
No, it's not intellectually incoherent. You're simply choosing what you will and won't say.
Well, wouldn't a reasonable person conclude that the reason you don't wish to say it is because you plan to raise it?
No, they wouldn't, because you could then go through, as I say, 250 different reliefs.
But at least
and I can't sit here and write a budget.
No, I'm not asking you to write a budget.
Well, you are actually, what you're asking me to do.
I'm asking you about national insurance contributions.
I know, but if I then give you answers on national insurance and write the budget on that, why shouldn't you move on to capital gains tax, inheritance tax, and as I say, another corporation tax, another 250 different reliefs?
All right, let's move on to talk about the euro, if we may. Famously, there are 5 tests which have to be met before we can join the euro. Gordon Brown has said the Treasury will be the custodians of those tests. Can you overrule the Treasury?
You wouldn't overrule them. It would be a collective decision of government.
But the Treasury are the custodians of the
tests. Of course they are, because they're the Treasury.
So Gordon Brown decides when they've been met?
No, the Treasury, when they say they're the custodian of the tests, obviously, as the Treasury, they are going to decide are these tests in a technical sense met, and of course the collective decision of the government will be whether they're met or not.
So Gordon Brown decides whether we have a referendum or not?
No, Gordon Brown doesn't. I've been again over this. Of course, the whole of the government takes a collective decision. But when we say the Treasury, the
Treasury decides whether the tests are met.
No, but the Treasury are the custodians of the tests in this sense, and it's very obvious why they should be. That in circumstances where there are economic conditions and economic tests, it's obviously right that we make it clear to people there's not going to be any political fiddling about with these tests. They have to be met in a genuine economic way.
And Gordon Brown is the man who will make that judgment.
Well, the judgment is made by the government as a whole, but of course Gordon will make the judgment with me and with and make it on the basis of the government as a whole.
Are we to take it then that the Agriculture Secretary, the Culture Secretary and so on will have a view on whether these tests have been met?
No. This is what it says. The Treasury are the custodians of the tests, and that is to make it clear to people that these are not going to be politically interfered with. They've got to be economically sound, but the decision as to whether to recommend entry into the euro has obviously got to be taken by the government as a whole. And when I was asked this question a couple of weeks ago, are you going to be involved? Well, of course we're going to be involved in it.
But essentially, you're rubber stamping Gordon Brown's decision.
No. I mean, I'm not saying that at all, and neither is he.
But he decides whether the tests have been met or not.
the Treasury, because they're economic tests, and the Treasury are the custodians of these economic tests, obviously, to make sure that it's not simply done on a political basis, but it's a genuine economic decision. The decision then, the judgment as to whether we recommend entry into the euro, of course, is taken by the government as a whole. And Gordon, who has been a brilliant Chancellor, I've no doubt at all, will make sure that those tests are properly adhered to.
And you'll rubber stamp it then?
No, I haven't said I'll rubber stamp it, Jeremy.
This takes us to the whole question of your judgment, Prime Minister. You have said...
Well, I've not made that judgment yet, have I?
No, you haven't made that judgment, and clearly you will exercise your judgment on that. But let's take a couple of examples of your judgment. Keith Vaz shouldn't be sacked from his job because he hasn't been found guilty of anything. Why did you sack Peter Mandelson?
For the reasons that I gave at the time.
Which were? Which
were that people had been misled, and whether it was inadvertent or not, it was right, he felt, and I felt, that he should go.
But he didn't do anything wrong. The inquiry found he did nothing wrong.
I said at the time that Peter went that I was sure that the inquiry would find that he'd done absolutely nothing improper at all.
Do you still think he misled you?
Well, I don't think it was a case of him misleading me, but as a result of answers that were given, people were misled. Anyway, that chapter, as it were, is closed.
Well, it's not entirely closed, because if you can, this is a man who's a close and trusted ally of yours. Mm-hmm. I suggest to you, you panicked.
Well, I'm sorry, but you're wrong. The reasons I gave are the reasons
but he didn't do anything wrong.
Valid.
I mean, the inquiry found he did nothing wrong.
I said at the time I believed that he'd done absolutely nothing improper in relation to passports.
Why did you sack him?
For the reason I gave at the time, that people had been misled, and however inadvertent, it was right that in those circumstances he went. And it was a tough decision. It was a very harsh decision.
In that case, why didn't you sack Keith Vaz?
Because Keith Vaz had absolutely nothing to do with misleading people, and the Hammond inquiry found that he had acted not merely had he not acted improperly, but he'd acted entirely properly throughout. So it would be grossly unjust to dismiss him.
So Keith Vaz is a good minister?
He actually has been an excellent European minister, and I think it's very, very sad that the moment the Hammond inquiry found that those allegations were unproven, the media just moved on to a whole stack of new allegations. And I think it is difficult for him in circumstances where people aren't prepared to look at whether the allegations are proven or not. And I really believe that quite strongly.
You just talked about him in the past tense, has been.
Well, he has been.
Has he got a place in your next government?
I'm not reshuffling on any basis, Jeremy, so the election has not happened.
When we look at some of these matters, particularly Mr. Mandelson and Mr. Vaz, essentially their mistake was to cozy up to the Hinduja brothers. Why should they have anything done against them for that, when you've done the same thing?
I totally agree with you. That's why Keith Vaz is still a minister, or was still a minister until Parliament was dissolved. And
but Peter Mandelson isn't.
And Peter Mandelson, because I told you at the time it was nothing to do with the Hinduja passport. So when you say to me, was there something corrupt in relation to the Hindujas and all the rest of it? No, there wasn't.
No, of course there wasn't. He was cleared in the inquiry.
Which is exactly what I said. I said at the time it was not in respect of that. And I said at the time of the Hammond inquiry that indicated that no one had acted improperly in relation to passports, which is why all this stuff about the Hindujas was all such nonsense. So, they were given their passports perfectly properly. They weren't even given them that quickly, and as the Hammond inquiry found, no one did anything wrong.
But these letters from you to the Hinduja brothers, two men with something of a cloud over them, in India at least, you're quite comfortable with all of those, are you? Yours ever, Tony?
I'm perfectly comfortable with them. They're leading members of the Asian community, and you say this cloud hanging over them.
You take money from them again?
I didn't take money from them, Jeremy, at all. They did donate money, as the Hinduja Foundation has donated money to many causes in this country. And I just say to you, in relation to the so-called shadow hanging over them, that is in relation to allegations that, to the best of my recollection, are something like 20 years out of date.
But do you think it's appropriate that your party takes money from people with a shadow hanging over them like that in India?
My party hasn't taken money from them.
Would you be happy if they did?
I don't believe it would be right for us to take money from people, except in circumstances where we're entirely satisfied that that's an appropriate thing to do. But as a matter of fact, we haven't taken any money from the Hindujas.
So the answer in that case would be yes?
No, we haven't taken any money from them.
Okay. Can we look at the campaign? When you look back to the launch of that campaign at St Olave's and St Saviour's School, how soon did you realise it was a mistake?
I don't think it was a mistake to launch in a school. I launched my first campaign in a school.
Come on. Seriously, you must have been at a point when you're there in front of the stained glass windows, you must have thought, I am the vicar of St Albans.
Well, I tell you what I thought. The thing I did think was, I hope that people pay some attention to what I'm actually saying, but that was a fond and naive view, because they didn't in the end.
Well, no, it was an audience of teenage girls.
Well, there were more
What
than
have they
that
got to do with
actually.
negative equity?
I mean...
But it was a mistake, wasn't it?
No, I don't believe it was a mistake to launch in the school at all. It was perfectly sensible to launch in the school, and people should pay attention to what we actually said, rather than whether there was a stained glass window behind me or there were, you know, girls in the front row of the audience or not.
You don't regret it?
I don't actually.
You weren't
no.
embarrassed by it?
No, and I think there are far more important issues in the campaign than that.
You didn't see the comical side of it?
I certainly saw the comical side of the newspapers the next day, but then you have to have an extended sense of humour in my business.
It's nice of Gordon Brown to take the rap for it, wasn't it?
I didn't know that he had taken
that for it.
Yes, he has,
more or less, yes.
Well, it would be totally unjust if he did.
Do you think, on the subject of Gordon Brown, he's your natural successor?
I think that, how many days are we out from the election? 3 days out from the election. It's very unwise for me to speculate as to whether I'm going to have this job after Thursday.
Well, I assume you'd be leader of the Labour Party.
Well, and certainly not to start speculating on who my successor may be. But I've said on many occasions when people have asked me, he is, in my view, one of the most brilliant people in British politics. He has done a fantastic job as Chancellor. It is not an ignoble ambition to be Prime Minister of this country, but as he says and as I say, let's get on and win the election.
You make him sound like the heir apparent.
I don't make him sound like anything. I simply say what I've always said.
When you've been fighting this campaign, there hasn't been a point in it when you haven't been ahead. Have you ever felt the slightest twinge of sympathy for poor old William Hague?
I don't feel any sympathy for what he's putting forward. And I think, you know, the Conservatives basically have learned absolutely nothing from the defeat in '97. They're putting forward policies for massive cuts in public investment, for return to debt funding. Hang on, no, you talk about sympathy.
Sympathy
That's
for
what they're
him
putting.
as leader of a party, presented as the underdog throughout the campaign.
Well, I sympathise with anyone who's leader of the Conservative Party, but I don't sympathise with somebody who is putting forward policies that I believe would genuinely... Not that I don't agree with, but I think would genuinely damage the country. And the policy, for example, on Europe, which hasn't really received much scrutiny, is one that would virtually have this country on the exit door for Europe. The policy of cutting a quarter... Right. No, hang on a minute.
No, with the greatest respect, we've spoken to him about Conservative policies. We don't need to talk to you about them. We'd like to talk to you about your government.
Exactly, but you're talking about the choice in the election, and just as you're the interviewer, I'm the person supposed to give the answers, right? And the answer to your question is that it is actually important to defeat the Conservatives in this election, because the policies they're standing for, like taking a quarter of the university budget away, are policies worth defeating.
Could you ever have too big a majority?
I haven't got any majority yet, and I have not and will not.
Well, you've got a majority of 179 in Parliament.
Yeah, but I haven't got a majority in this election.
Could you have too big a majority after this election?
I'm not speculating on the majority, because I don't have one. And you guys in the media can speculate about it.
I'm not asking you to speculate. I'm not asking you to speculate. I'm just asking a perfectly straightforward question. Could you have too big a majority?
I know exactly what you're asking me, and so do you.
Could you have too big a majority?
I am not getting into the business of predicting majorities or saying whether I think this majority is right or that majority is wrong. Any politician in my position, right, going into an election campaign is out and hungry for every piece of support. And I'm asking the support because I believe in the policies I'm putting forward. And you people in the media can speculate on the size of the majority. The opinion polls can, even the bookmakers can, but it's the public who are the boss, and they will make the decision, and we should leave it to them to make the decision on the basis of what they believe.
Could too many of them decide to vote for you?
You're not putting that question forward seriously, are you?
I am.
What? I should sit here and tell you, no,
is there a
sorry.
danger in having too big a majority?
Well, we haven't got any majority yet.
No, you haven't done the election yet.
Exactly, which is why let's get on and talk about the issues in the election. Instead of this sort of, stuff about, is the majority going to be this or that when we haven't got one?
I'm not asking you what you think it's going to be. I'm merely asking you,
Prime
Minister.
Effectively.
No, I'm merely asking whether you think there's any danger of having too big a majority.
I think there's a danger if people don't come out and vote for what they believe in, and I hope they vote for that.
You don't think for the health of democracy that there is a question at issue here about how big a majority is healthy.
Surely the single biggest question in a democracy is to get people to vote for what they believe in. The idea that the Conservative Party come along, every strategy having failed in this campaign, their campaign useless because they've lost all the arguments on policy, and say to the public, we can't think of a good reason for voting for us, we really can't, but please, Labour might win on Friday, so lend us your vote and give us a bit of a shot. I mean, it is unbelievable that they should come forward with that. And the fact of the matter is, you asked me if I felt sorry for William Hague a moment or two ago. As I said to you, I feel sorry for people leading the Conservative Party in its present state, but I don't feel sorry for people putting forward the policies they're putting forward. And if the public want us to put that money into schools and hospitals, if they want us to strengthen the economy, come out and vote for it. Don't vote for the Conservative Party out of sympathy or something when they're actually going to reverse the very policies people support.
Okay, Prime Minister, thank you very much. We recorded that interview a little earlier this evening. Now, a key witness in the Lord Archer perjury trial has begun her evidence at the Old Bailey. Angela Peppiatt worked at Conservative Central Office keeping Lord Archer's appointments diary when he was the deputy chairman of the party. Archer faces 7 charges, 4 of perverting the course of justice and 2 of perjury, all of which he denies. Our reporter Michael Crick is in court every day. I asked him what was Angie Peppiatt's story.
Well, in headline terms, she's saying that Jeffrey Archer ordered her to fake a diary for use in his 1987 libel trial. She says that in the spring of 1987, he came along to her with a blank Let's diary for the previous year, together with a handwritten list of names, and told her to put those names in the diary. She says, he asked me to fill in the names on the piece of paper that he had handed me, because his diary or diaries had been requested by the lawyers in the trial. So she did that and handed the diary over to Archer's lawyers, Mishkon's. She says also that the diary was bound up, in her recollection, with brown tape. So the pages either side of the bit that she'd been asked to read were bound up with brown tape.
Does she have any corroboration?
Yes, she does, because in the process of writing these entries in, she took all sorts of photocopies of the diary in its various stages, including one with a front page of the Times. She kept the list of names that Archer gave her. She made a statement at the time and signed it, detailing his instructions. And most important of all, she also kept the 1986 diary, which she'd kept of his appointments, and which the prosecution says that he kept, he hid from the libel trial.
Did Archer give her any explanation of why he wanted her to do this?
Well, she was extremely concerned, she says, at the time, and queried it, and wanted to know why Archer couldn't simply put in the 1986 appointments diary. And apparently Archer said, according to Angie Peppiatt, that his lawyers, Bob Alexander, who's now Lord Alexander, and Lord Mishkon, his solicitor, had told him that this would be perfectly in order, because if my diary was presented, it would show political sensitivity to certain names. And she says there was a lot of concern at the time about security, because it wasn't long after the Brighton bomb. But she was worried that she was going to be, she was involved in a deception, and so that's why she kept all these documents as insurance and protection. She's kept them ever since? Ever since. And they were, she handed them over to the police when they began this inquiry. And some of them she actually only discovered about 3.5 weeks ago in a carrier bag at home, and they were handed over as well. It's
immensely complicated.
Oh, it is. I mean, there's huge ring binders on the jury desks and on the witness stand, and papers and all these diaries, and confusion over dates and photocopies and photocopies of photocopies. I mean, as Mrs. Peppiatt herself said, it is quite confusing. And I think her evidence is likely to go on for a couple more days. The prosecution haven't finished with her yet. And then the defence, in their cross-examination, I think will, for the first time in this case, will reveal what Jeffrey Archer's defence is to these charges, which of course he denies.
Michael, thank you.